The rain drummed steadily against the windshield as Marcus Webb pulled his yellow taxi to the curb outside the Four Seasons Hotel in Manhattan. At 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night, most decent fares had dried up, but the luxury hotels still offered hope for one last profitable ride before calling it a night. He'd been driving for 12 hours straight, his back aching from the worn-out driver's seat that he couldn't afford to replace. A figure emerged from the hotel's golden glow, hurrying through the rain with a phone pressed to his ear. Even in the dim streetlight, Marcus could tell this was money. The man's tailored coat probably cost more than Marcus made in a month, and his confident stride spoke of someone accustomed to the world bending to his will. "JFK Airport, Terminal 4, the passenger said curtly as he slid into the back seat, not bothering to look up from his phone. His voice carried the crisp authority of someone used to being obeyed instantly. Marcus glanced in the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of the man's face illuminated by his phone screen. He was younger than expected, maybe early 40s, with the kind of sharp features that suggested both intelligence and ruthlessness. As they pulled into traffic, Marcus's passenger continued his phone conversation in clipped, businesslike tones. Something about quarterly projections, market volatility, and strategic acquisitions. The words flowed like a foreign language to Marcus, who had learned to tune out the corporate jargon that filled his cab during rides to airports and high-end restaurants. The man's name, Marcus would later learn, was David Chen, the CEO of a tech empire worth billions, though he looked like any other stressed executive trying to catch a red-eye flight. In the rearview mirror, Marcus watched him scroll through emails with mechanical precision, his face lit by the cold blue glow of multiple screens. For the first 20 minutes of the ride, they existed in separate worlds. The driver focused on navigating through the late-night traffic, the passenger absorbed in his digital universe of profits and problems. Neither had any reason to believe that this routine late-night fare would become anything more than a forgettable transaction. Block 2. The opening traffic on the Van Wyck Expressway had slowed to a crawl due to construction, turning what should have been a 40-minute ride into something approaching an hour and a half. David Chen glanced up from his phone for the first time since entering the taxi, his irritation evident as he checked his watch. A Patek Philippe that cost more than most people's cars. "How much longer?" Chen asked, his voice tight with the controlled impatience of someone whose time was measured in millions of dollars per hour. He had a board meeting in London in 18 hours, and missing this flight would cascade into a week of disrupted meetings and rescheduled negotiations. Marcus met his eyes in the rearview mirror. "About 40 minutes more. Maybe 50 if this doesn't clear up. Construction's been going on for months." His voice was quiet, steady, with the patient resignation of someone who had learned that the world rarely moved at the pace you wanted it to. Chen's jaw tightened as he returned to his phone, fingers flying across the screen as he tried to manage his empire from the back of a taxi. But after another 10 minutes of barely moving, his frustration boiled over into restless energy. He found himself actually looking out the window for the first time, watching the city crawl by beyond the rain-streaked glass. "You do this every night?" Chen asked suddenly, surprising himself with the question. He couldn't remember the last time he'd initiated a conversation with service staff that wasn't directly related to what he needed from them. Marcus glanced up again, noting something different in the passenger's tone. Less command, more genuine curiosity. "Most nights. Been driving taxi for 8 years now." He paused, considering whether to say more. "Started when I was 52. The detail hung in the air between them. Chen found himself curious about what would drive a man to start a new career in his 50s, especially one as demanding as taxi driving. In Chen's world, 52 was when you were supposed to be hitting your stride, not starting over. Block 3. First glimpses. "That's unusual," Chen said, his business instincts kicking in as he studied the driver more carefully. In the rearview mirror, he could see Marcus had the weathered face of someone who had lived through things, not the soft features of someone who had always known comfort. Most people don't start driving taxi in their 50s. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his hands steady on the wheel as they inched forward in traffic. Chen found himself waiting for an answer in a way that surprised him. Usually, when he asked questions, he expected immediate responses. But something about this driver's deliberate pace made him willing to wait. "Had another life before this," Marcus finally said. Things changed. The simplicity of the statement somehow carried more weight than a detailed explanation would have. Chen recognized the tone, It was how he himself talked when discussing topics he didn't want to elaborate on. The traffic began moving slightly faster, and Marcus smoothly shifted lanes to avoid a construction bottleneck. Chen noticed the driver's movements were precise, professional, despite the beat-up condition of the taxi. The cab was clean but clearly old, with cracked vinyl seats and a dashboard held together with careful patches of duct tape. "What kind of life?" Chen asked, again surprising himself. He couldn't remember the last time he'd been genuinely curious about a stranger's story. His world was so insulated, so controlled, that he rarely encountered people whose lives were mysteries to him. Marcus's eyes found his in the mirror again. There was something measuring in that gaze, as if the driver was deciding whether his passenger was worth the truth. "I was a teacher," he said simply. "Taught high school mathematics for 28 years. The revelation hit Chen unexpectedly. He had imagined any number of backgrounds for this late-night driver, but educator hadn't been among them. There was something incongruous about a man who had shaped young minds for nearly 3 decades now, navigating the gritty reality of taxi driving through the small hours of the night. Block 4. The teacher's fall. The traffic finally began to move more freely, but Chen found himself no longer anxious about his flight time. Something about Marcus's revelation had shifted his attention entirely. 28 years, he repeated. That's almost a full career. What happened? Marcus was quiet for several blocks, and Chen began to think he wouldn't answer. But as they passed under the yellow glow of streetlights, creating a rhythm of light and shadow across his face, the driver began to speak. "Budget cuts," Marcus said simply. District was restructuring. They offered early retirement packages to senior teachers, anyone over 50 with more than 20 years in. Made it sound like a good deal, like they were doing us a favor. He paused, changing lanes with the same careful precision Chen had noticed. The package seemed generous at first glance, Marcus continued. Lump sum payment, continued health benefits for 2 years, pension starting at 62 instead of 65. For someone tired of fighting for supplies and dealing with increased class sizes, it looked like a gift. Chen leaned forward slightly, his business mind automatically calculating the financial implications. Early retirement packages were often designed to look appealing while actually saving companies money in the long run. But it wasn't enough, he said, not really a question. Wasn't even close, Marcus confirmed. The lump sum barely covered my daughter's college tuition for her final year. The health insurance ran out just when my wife got sick. And the pension... He shook his head. Turns out early retirement means early pension, which means a lot less money per month than I'd planned for the rest of my life. The windshield wipers continued their steady rhythm as they drove through Queens, past shuttered storefronts and all-night diners where the city's invisible workforce grabbed coffee between shifts. Chen found himself seeing the landscape differently, aware for perhaps the first time of the economic reality most people navigated daily. "So, you started driving," Chen said. "So, I started driving." Block 5. The wife's illness. They were making good time now, the construction zone behind them. But Chen found himself hoping the traffic would slow down again. There was something about the steady rhythm of the ride, the cocoon of the taxi moving through the night, that made conversation feel both intimate and safe. "You mentioned your wife got sick." Marcus's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. "Cancer," he said. "Started about 6 months after I retired. Ovarian cancer, stage 3 by the time they caught it." The clinical terms seemed inadequate for the weight they carried. Chen had lost his own father to cancer 5 years earlier, but the circumstances had been entirely different. David Chen Sr. had died in a private suite at Memorial Sloan Kettering, surrounded by the best oncologists money could buy. The disease had still won, but they had fought it with every available weapon. "The treatments were expensive?" Chen asked, though he already knew the answer. "Everything was expensive," Marcus replied. "Even with insurance, the copays and deductibles, we burned through our savings in the first 6 months. Had to take out a second mortgage on the house just to keep up with the medical bills." The taxi passed a billboard advertising a luxury car dealership, and Chen couldn't help but think about the casual way wealth insulated you from so many of life's fundamental anxieties. When his father had been diagnosed, the first question hadn't been about cost. It had been about getting the best care, the fastest appointments, the most promising experimental treatments. "The worst part wasn't the money," Marcus continued, his voice quieter now. It was watching her worry about the money when she should have been focusing on getting better. She'd lie awake at night, not because of pain or fear of dying, but because she was calculating how much each treatment cost and wondering if we were destroying our future for a few more months. Chen stared out the window at the passing lights, feeling something unfamiliar twist in his chest. In his world, problems were solved with resources, with the right connections, with the application of wealth and power. The idea of being helpless in the face of a solvable problem was almost incomprehensible to him. Block 6. Love in the time of crisis. She sounds like she was a practical woman, Chen said, not knowing what else to say. The comment felt inadequate, but Marcus smiled, the first real smile Chen had seen from him. Margaret was practical about everything except me, Marcus said. She married an idealistic teacher who thought changing young lives was worth more than money. She never complained about the small apartment when we were newlyweds, never complained about the used cars or the budget vacations. But when she got sick, all she could think about was how she was ruining our financial future. They passed John F. Kennedy Airport's first signs, and Chen realized with something approaching regret that their journey was almost over. In his normal life, he would have already moved on mentally to his flight, his meetings, his next set of problems to solve. Instead, he found himself invested in this story, in this quiet man's life. "How long were you married?" Chen asked. 34 years, Marcus replied. "Met her when I was 26, she was 24. She was working as a nurse. I was in my second year of teaching. We were both idealistic enough to think we could change the world and live on love and good intentions." The pride in his voice was unmistakable, even tinged with sadness. Chen tried to imagine 34 years with the same person, the kind of deep knowledge and companionship that would develop over more than 3 decades. His own marriage had lasted 7 years before ending in a divorce that made headlines in the business press, though he hadn't thought about Elena in months. "During the treatments, she made me promise not to go into debt for experimental procedures," Marcus continued. "She said she couldn't stand the thought of me driving taxi for the rest of my life just to pay for treatments that might not work anyway." Chen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air. The casual mention of driving taxi as the ultimate sacrifice revealed just how far Marcus had fallen from his original life. "But you're driving taxi anyway." "But I'm driving taxi anyway," Marcus agreed. Block 7. The hardest decisions. "She died 18 months after the diagnosis," Marcus said quietly as they approached the airport. "The last few weeks she was in hospice care. I'd sit with her during the day, then drive taxi all night to pay for everything. The funeral, the remaining medical bills, the mortgage payments that had piled up." Chen found himself gripping his phone tighter, though he'd stopped checking his emails miles ago. The stark reality of Marcus's choices was almost incomprehensible to him. In Chen's world, when problems arose, you threw money at them until they went away. The idea of sitting with a dying spouse by day and driving strangers around by night just to stay afloat was a kind of heroism he'd never considered. "The night she died," Marcus continued, "I was actually in this taxi. Got the call from the hospice around 2 a.m. I was driving some drunk kids home from a club in Manhattan, and my phone rang." He paused, the memory clearly still painful. "The nurse was very kind. She said Margaret had been asking for me, but she'd passed peacefully about 10 minutes before I could get there." Chen closed his eyes, trying to imagine receiving that call, that final, ultimate failure to be where you needed to be when it mattered most. His throat felt tight. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it in a way he rarely meant anything. "I finished the fare," Marcus said, and Chen heard both pride and guilt in the admission. "Dropped those kids off in Brooklyn, then drove straight to the hospice. Margaret was still there, still looked peaceful. The nurse said she'd told her I was working hard to take care of her, that she understood." They were entering the airport complex now, passing the signs for different terminals. Chen should have been checking his flight information, grabbing his bags, preparing for the transition back to his high-powered life. Instead, he sat motionless, feeling like he was witnessing something sacred in this stranger's quiet recounting of loss. "That was 3 years ago," Marcus said. "I kept driving partly because I needed the money, but mostly because I didn't know what else to do." Block 8. The daughter's dream. "You mentioned your daughter's college tuition," Chen said as they approached Terminal 4. He found himself desperate to understand the full scope of Marcus's choices, the complex web of love and sacrifice that had led to this moment. Marcus's face brightened noticeably in the rearview mirror. "Sarah," he said, and Chen could hear the pride and love in just that single word. "She's finishing her residency at Johns Hopkins now. Pediatric surgery." The revelation hit Chen like a physical blow. All of this, the early retirement, the taxi driving, the financial struggle during his wife's illness, had been in service of raising a daughter who was now saving children's lives. "She doesn't know about the taxi driving, does she?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. "She knows I drive taxi. What she doesn't know is why I really started, or how much I needed the money. She thinks it's just something I do to stay busy in retirement." He paused. "I told her the early retirement package was more generous than it was, that her mom and I were financially comfortable." They pulled up to the departure level of Terminal 4, joining the line of cars dropping off passengers. Chen made no move to gather his belongings. Why not tell her the truth? "Because she offered to quit medical school and get a job when her mother got sick," Marcus said simply. "Said she could finish her degree later. That family was more important than her dreams. It took everything Margaret and I had to convince her to stay in school." Chen thought about the crushing weight of medical school debt, the years of delayed gratification required to become a surgeon, the sacrifice of watching a parent struggle while pursuing your own future. "She would have quit," he said, understanding. "In a heartbeat," Marcus confirmed. "Sarah's got her mother's heart. She'd give up anything for family. But Margaret and I didn't sacrifice everything so our daughter could sacrifice everything too. We wanted to break that cycle." The line moved forward, and Chen realized they were probably just minutes away from his departure. The thought filled him with an unexpected sense of loss. In less than an hour, he'd learned more about real courage and love than he'd encountered in years of his carefully curated existence. Block 9. The Weight of Success. "Does Sarah know how proud you are of her?" Chen asked as they waited in the passenger drop-off line. Around them, other travelers hurried past with their luggage, most absorbed in their phones or their own urgent concerns. "I tell her every week when she calls," Marcus said, "but I don't think she really understands what it means. When you're in the middle of residency, working 100-hour weeks, dealing with life and death every day, it's hard to step back and see the bigger picture." Chen thought about his own relationship with his father, how success had always been measured in quarterly earnings and market share rather than service to others. David Chen Sr. had been proud of his son's business accomplishments, but Chen wondered now if his father had ever felt the kind of profound, selfless pride that he heard in Marcus's voice. "She called me last week," Marcus continued, upset because she'd lost her first patient, a 7-year-old who needed emergency surgery after a car accident. She was devastated, questioning whether she was cut out for surgery, whether she should switch to something easier. The taxi moved forward in line, bringing them closer to Chen's departure, but he found himself hoping for delays, for traffic, for anything that would extend this conversation. "What did you tell her?" "I told her about the first student I lost," Marcus said. "Kid named David Rodriguez, actually. Bright kid, great at math, but his home life was chaos. I spent extra time with him, helped him apply for scholarships, thought I was making a real difference. Then he got caught up in gang violence and was shot walking home from school one night." Chen felt the weight of that loss, the way it must have challenged everything Marcus believed about his ability to change lives through teaching. "How did you handle it?" "I didn't, for a while," Marcus admitted. "Questioned everything, wondered if any of it mattered. But then I realized that David Rodriguez wasn't my only student. There were dozens of others who went on to college, who built good lives, who maybe made different choices because I was there to encourage them." The parallel to his daughter's situation was clear, but Chen sensed there was more to the story. Block 10. The Ripple Effect. "I told Sarah something that night that I'd never told her before," Marcus said as they finally reached the front of the departure line. "About a student I taught 15 years ago, a girl named Maria Santos. She was failing math, convinced she was stupid, ready to drop out of high school." Chen found himself leaning forward, completely absorbed in the story despite the fact that he should have been out of the taxi 5 minutes ago to make his flight. Maria's parents worked double shifts at a factory, barely spoke English, couldn't help her with homework. She was convinced she'd end up in the same dead-end jobs, that education was just something for other people's kids. Marcus's voice carried the weight of memory, of countless students whose futures had hung in the balance of a teacher's belief in them. I kept her after school 3 days a week for an entire semester. Not detention, tutoring. We worked through basic algebra, then geometry, then calculus. She went from failing to getting A's, but more importantly, she started believing she was smart. The story felt personal to Chen in a way he couldn't quite explain. His own path to success had been smoothed by every advantage money could buy. Private schools, SAT tutors, college admission consultants. The idea of someone changing their entire life trajectory through the dedication of a single teacher seemed almost mythical. Maria graduated valedictorian of her high school class, Marcus continued. Got a full scholarship to MIT, then to medical school. She's an emergency room doctor now in Los Angeles, probably saved hundreds of lives. She still sends me Christmas cards. Chen felt a strange tightness in his chest. You never told Sarah this story before? I told her that night, Marcus said. I told her that when you save one person, you can't always see the ripple effects. That 7-year-old she lost might have been someone's Maria, but the next kid she saves might grow up to cure cancer or become a teacher who changes other lives. The profundity of it hit Chen like a wave. All of his business success, all of his wealth and power, and he couldn't think of a single moment when he'd changed someone's life the way Marcus had changed Maria, the way Sarah was changing her patients' lives. Block 11. The real wealth. Sarah cried when I told her about Maria, Marcus said softly, but they were good tears. She said she'd never thought about her work that way, never considered that the children she saves might go on to save others. Chen realized he was gripping his phone so tightly his knuckles were white. Around them, other passengers were getting out of taxis and rushing into the terminal, but he sat paralyzed by the weight of Marcus's words. His flight to London suddenly seemed insignificant compared to this conversation. 2 days later, she called me again, Marcus continued. Said she'd just finished a surgery on a 12-year-old who'd been hit by a car while riding his bike. Touch and go for hours, but she saved him. When she was talking to the parents afterward, seeing their relief and gratitude, she said she finally understood what I meant about ripple effects. The taxi had been stopped at the curb for several minutes now, but Chen made no move to leave. Other drivers were honking behind them, impatient to reach the departure zone, but Marcus seemed as reluctant to end the conversation as Chen was. She asked me something that night that really hit me, Marcus said. She asked if I ever regretted leaving teaching, if I ever wondered what my life would have been like if I'd made different choices. Chen found himself holding his breath, waiting for the answer to a question he hadn't realized he needed to hear. I told her the truth, Marcus said, that I think about my former students every day, that there's a part of me that will always be a teacher, just like there's a part of her that will always be a healer. But I also told her that watching her become the person she is, knowing that I helped make it possible for her to save lives, that's not a consolation prize. That's the greatest achievement of my life. Chen felt tears he hadn't shed in years burning behind his eyes. In his world, achievement was measured in dollars and market dominance, in being featured on magazine covers and commanding respect through fear. But sitting in this beat-up taxi, listening to this quiet man describe real wealth, Chen realized he'd been using the wrong metrics his entire life. Block 12. The choice. Sir, Marcus said gently, your flight? Chen looked at his watch and realized he had about 20 minutes to get through security and to his gate. It would be close, but possible if he hurried. The London meeting would proceed as planned, another step in his empire's expansion, another day of wielding power and accumulating wealth. But something had shifted fundamentally in the last hour. The man who had entered this taxi was different from the one sitting here now, and Chen wasn't sure he could simply return to his old life pretending nothing had changed. Marcus, he said, surprising himself by using the driver's name for the first time. What would you do if money wasn't a factor? If you could choose any life you wanted? Marcus met his eyes in the rearview mirror, and Chen saw understanding there, as if the driver recognized the real question being asked. I'd probably go back to teaching, Marcus said without hesitation. Maybe start a tutoring program for kids like Maria, kids whose parents can't afford private help. Give them the same chance I gave her. Chen nodded, feeling something crystallize in his mind. How much would something like that cost? To set up properly, I mean, to really make a difference. I've actually thought about it, Marcus admitted. To do it right. Rent space, hire other retired teachers, provide supplies and resources, Probably need about $500,000 to get started. Maybe another $200,000 a year to operate. $700,000. Chen spent more than that on his art collection last month. It was pocket change, a rounding error in his quarterly budget. But for Marcus, it represented an impossible dream, a fantasy as remote as winning the lottery. And if someone offered to fund something like that? Chen asked carefully. Marcus's eyes sharpened in the mirror. I'd want to know why. And I'd want to make sure they understood that real education can't be bought.